guys. Now if you've seen my last video, then you'll know that we fitted TLC side skirt extensions and rear bumper spats to my Mach 6 Fiesta ST. Now I absolutely love them. I think they look so good, and since I fitted them I haven't been able to stop taking photos of this car, especially the back of it. But I mentioned it at the end of the last video, and I'll say it again now because that's the purpose of this video, and that's that when we fitted them, although they look great, they've actually emphasized something that I don't like about the back of the car. They actually make the back of the car look quite a bit wider, but that further exaggerates just how far the standard alloys are tucked into the arches. I mean, they don't look too bad, but I really wish that these wheels were spaced out quite a bit further. Now I could go for an aftermarket wheel with a more appropriate offset that would fit the arches a lot better, but if I'm honest, I actually really like the standard ST wheels and I don't want to change them. I really want to keep these wheels standard. Plus I think we're going to be refurbing them soon anyway because they look pretty beaten up. But there are a few options in terms of spacing the wheels out a bit wider. The first option is to fit a spacer between the wheel and the hub, and that should bring the wheel out. You can get them in plenty of different sizes. Now that's probably the easiest option, and it's probably also the most common option, but I'm not really a fan of the way that looks because it brings the wheel out a lot further from the brake disc and the brake caliper, and I don't really want that big gap in between. Also, I've heard that it will wear out the rear wheel bearings a lot quicker and you'll have to change them a lot sooner. And the other option is to use an axle spacer. Now this actually fits between the rear beam and the stub axle, so it spaces the whole hub out a lot further, so the brakes and everything come with it. And this should also put less stress on the wheel bearings. Now there are a couple of different options when it comes to axle spacers as well. There's a couple of different places that you can get them from, and the quality varies as well. So you can get cast aluminium ones, but I've heard horror stories of these actually crumbling once they're fitted. They just oxidize and pretty much crumble to pieces. These are actually made from billet, and they're made by a company called Anembo Engineering. I'll leave a link to these and their website in the description so you can find these, but these are made so that they don't crumble like their cast counterparts. They come in plenty of different sizes, and they can actually make these to any sort of width that you really want, depending on what wheels you have and what offset you've got and things like that. These are 20mm spacers, and I think you can probably get away with going up to 30mm. They do make 31s as standard, but I'm not really sure quite how much. I did have a quick measure and it looks like 30 would fit, but I asked online and most of you guys on Facebook said that 20mm would be fine. They also come with some brand new high tensile bolts to make sure everything's held in place nicely. So yeah, let's get fitting these. So the first thing was to loosen all the wheel nuts, and then I could jack up the back of the car. With the car jacked up, I lowered it onto axle stands supporting the car from the sills. I could then undo the wheel nuts the rest of the way. Then I could jack up the rear beam and undo the bolts holding the bottom of the shocks to the axle. After I'd loosened the bolts, I then undid them the rest of the way with an impact driver. With both sides off, I could use the jack underneath the rear beam to lower it so the springs could fall out. Literally. And then I could just pull the other spring out. Now the reason we remove the rear springs is so we can get access to the 4 bolts that hold the stub axle to the rear beam. So that's these 4 bolts here, and we also need to disconnect that ABS sensor by removing that little bolt there. So I'm going to undo the 8mm bolt holding in the ABS sensor and the 13mm bolts holding the stub axle to the rear beam. Okay, so now they're loose, I'm just going to back 2 of them all the way out, and I'm going to leave 2 in for the time being just because I don't want the whole hub assembly to just drop away. So I'm going to remove 2 and then see if I can figure out how I'm going to just maneuver this out of the way slightly, put the axle spacer in, and then bolt it all back up. Okay, so I'm just going to carefully wind out the remaining 2 bolts and hopefully just be able to keep this all in one piece while we slip the axle spacers in here. Okay, that's all the bolts out, so now, in theory, that should come away. The problem I've got now is all the brake lines and everything are still attached, and I don't quite know how I'm going to get the ABS sensor out. Oh, I actually think I might have to remove the brake caliper just to make this a little bit easier. Okay, I'm just going to remove the brakes really quickly. So I'm just going to pry the ABS sensor out. Okay, so the ABS sensor removed, the dust shield out of the way, and the hub's off. Now the stub axle actually has these little locating pins here and here, which locate into the rear beam, into those two holes there. But our axle spacer doesn't actually have cutouts for these, but not to worry, I'm just going to grind them off and file them flat. Now I think actually getting these installed is going to be rather tricky because there's so many different pieces that I've got to get all together. I've got the dust shield, which you've got to make sure goes on. Obviously we've got to put the spacer on, but we've also got to get this ABS sensor into the back of the stub axle, but we haven't got all that much wire to play with, and we've still got to get everything else in place as well. So I think pretty much that needs to go through there. So if I put one of the bolts through, or a couple of the bolts through, to hold it in place. The dust shield's got to go on. Okay, so that is pretty much how we're going to go, but somehow I've got to get all this in here together. Yeah, okay, so the ABS bolt actually has to go on now because you can't get to it once the spacer's in place. That's the difficult bit. I can just get a couple of these bolts started. Okay, so I've got the axle spacers in and I've got all the bolts snugged up. They're not torqued yet. There is quite a specific torque sequence for these. I'll go through that in just a minute, but before I do that, I just want to get all the brakes back on and then I can torque up those bolts. Now, I was really hoping to not have to do this. I thought maybe I could save some time by not removing the brakes, but honestly, it's just made it harder in the long run because now I've got to undo all these caliper bolts. Okay, so this side's all back together. I had to piss about with the brakes for quite a while because I had to take the caliper off and then rewind the piston and all that stuff, but you've seen me do that plenty of times, so I wasn't going to go through all that again. I cannot be bothered to film all that. I'm going to have to do it on the other side as well, but that's back on now. So now I need to torque up the bolts that are holding the stub axle and all this assembly via the spacer to the rear beam. Now the tightening sequence from forward for these bolts is quite specific. Now I'm not actually sure if we'd have to do it with these because they're obviously not the original factory bolts, but I'm going to do it anyway because I've got the manual to hand, so it's just really for peace of mind. So they've got to be tightened in a sequence, starting with this one. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So in that sequence we have to tighten them to 25 Newton meters, then loosen them 90 degrees, then tighten them back to 25 Newton meters in the same sequence, and then another 50 degrees from there. So in that sequence then, let's go for number 1 to 25 Newton meters. Now I've actually got to loosen them all 90 degrees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little green mark at the top of each one. And then I'm going to loosen number 1 to 90 degrees. Then the same with number 2. And then number 3. And number 4. Okay, I don't really see what the point of this is, but I think the original factory bolts are some sort of stretch bolt. These I really don't think they're going to be, but I want to follow the sequence anyway just for peace of mind. So let's go number 1 back to 25 Newton meters. Okay. Number 2. Number 3. number 4. Okay, and then it says we need to go for another 50 degrees. So I'm going to grab the breaker bar and starting on number 1. Okay, I think that's about 50 degrees. So number 2. Number 3. And number 4. Done. So now it's time to move on to the passenger side. I'm going to try and blast this out as quick as I can because that first side gave me a hell of a lot of hassle and it took me way longer than I thought it was going to. But to try and speed up the process on this side, I'm actually going to take the brake caliper and everything off first. I didn't really want to do it, but to be honest, I think it would just make things so much quicker if I just get that out of the way first. So I'm going to remove that and then crack on and fit the spacer on this side. Okay, so that's the spacers in on both sides. Everything's torqued up, all the brakes are back on, all that sort of stuff is pretty much ready to go back on the ground. But first we need to put the springs back in. So now I can start to jack up the rear axle a little bit, try and get the springs in position. Then I can get these bolts back in. Now we can put the wheels back on. Remove the axle stands. Lower the car. Then tighten the wheel nuts. And we are done. So let's have a look at just how these are sitting with the 20mm spacers. That looks so much better already. I love it. That looks so good. I'll tell you what, if anything, maybe I would get custom ones if I was to do it again and get 25mm. I do think 30 with these standard wheels might be a little bit much. Like, I think it would be legal. I think it would just fit, you know, under the arches from, you know, like a legal point because it can't stick out further, obviously. But I do think that these are pretty much perfect. Like, I'm definitely not complaining, but yeah, like spot on from them guys. And you know, from what I've heard about these, they are really good quality as well. They definitely felt and looked good quality, well made, and all that sort of stuff. So like I said at the beginning, I'll leave a link in the description to the spacers that I bought, and that's on Anembo Engineering's website, so you can find these or any other sizes if you're looking for them yourself. But I am super happy with these. They look so good, and they weren't that difficult to fit. It was a bit of a faff, and I've been out here all day, but that's more down to the car rather than the spacers. After the last video, we fitted the side skirt extensions and the rear spats. I noticed that the wheels were too tucked in, so it was kind of like a knock-on effect, but we did something that made it look nicer, and I picked out something that actually you could then see that I didn't like that was worse. And maybe you guys can see, I can see something now. Now I've got these wider wheels at the back, I'm thinking, oh, I kind of think I need that now as well. Let me know in the comments what you think that might be. But for this video, it's time to end. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.